you who are online. We've got a bumper turnout in church this evening. We must have about 15 people here. And I think there are about another 10 or 12 online. So welcome to you all. This is the fourth of the 5 talks this week between the Betrothal and Harvest. Housekeeping rules, as ever, particularly for those of you online who are currently blocked by Trevor. He's now sitting down, that's all right. Is please keep yourself on mute. If you have a question, those of you online, could you put it in the chat function, please? Every night is a different setup. This night, tonight, I am actually on the main computer and doing the camera, and Ted is speaking, which is sort of the opposite of last night. We will see if it all works, but hopefully it will. The system seems to be quite robust. Our speaker tonight, of course, easy to say, needs no introduction. Ted Green, whom we know in many different ways. You'll have seen on the description of himself that it gives in the programme for this week, a photograph from 1969. There are a few more dishonest photographs than that one. Ted served in the army for many years. He was the, the director of the museum, the Staffordshire Regimental Museum, and all sorts of other roles within the church. He's going to talk today about the Angel of Mons and spirituality in the First World War. And the first thing I've got to do is actually screen share for him. So here is the first test of whether it's all going to work or not. Right, I think, Ted, I can hand over to you. So do turn your microphone off when I turn mine off.
Mine's already on. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me within the church? And welcome to everyone who's online. Trevor said on Tuesday evening that he wasn't quite sure that the talk he was going to give quite lived up to the title. And I thought it did, but with me tonight, it's certainly not. When Chris approached me some time ago to talk about the Angel of Mons, for obvious reasons with the theme this week, I thought, well, that'll take 5 minutes. What else shall I do? As you do well away, I said, oh, I'll talk about spirituality in the First World War. As I came to write this talk, I realized that A, that's a massive subject, and B, I'm totally unqualified to talk about it. So what you're actually getting today, I'm going to talk to you about the Angel of Mons. I'm also going to talk about another one of the great legends of the First World War, the Golden or the Hanging Virgin on the Basilica in Albert. But in between times, when I was thinking about spirituality, I started to think about people who did things in the First World War, driven very much by their Christian faith, and that's part of it. Trevor on Tuesday mentioned that possibly the archangels might have gone back to the days when the Israelites were pantheistic, I think that's the right word, and that they might have been gods in a previous life. Chris last night talked about 4 rectors, who at one stage he described as angels. And I suddenly thought, I'm talking about 3 blokes. So what about the seraphim? These are all cherubim. So a rather late addition. I'm giving you 7 heroines from the First World War. I'm not strictly sure what drove them. In some cases, it certainly was their Christian faith, in others not. But I just wanted to produce a little bit of balance. It may be that Joanne did that on Monday, but I was at Deanery Synod, so unfortunately I had to miss her talk. So anyway, so let's get on. The Angel of Mons, he says, pressing hopefully. There we are. Right, I want you to imagine that it's August 1914, right at the beginning of August 1914. As of the 1st of August, the First World War had really started. And there was a lot of pressure on the British government to follow its commitment, both in the Triple Entente to France and to Russia, and also to Belgium, whose neutrality we had guaranteed in 1839. It was touch and go, actually, whether the government took us to war, but they did, and it was a very popular thing. Now, on the pictures you can see there, on the bottom left, that's the crowds outside Buckingham Palace after we'd declared war. The top right is a group of regular soldiers marching off to war. And also I put on there is two of the less violent and less sexual posters that were around about what was called the rape of Belgium. Some of them I really didn't feel were suitable for tonight's talk. But there was this massive euphoria. As you all, nearly all know, I'm sure, there was this, it'll all be over by Christmas, and so on and so forth. However, there were some facts which I suspect that most people didn't know. We had a small regular army which really policed the empire. It was extremely well trained for the job that it did. We were able to mobilize around about 100,000 men. Now, this isn't a military history talk, so any of the military history buffs don't take me to task too much for really rounding up the numbers or rounding them down, but say about 100,000. We were facing, or at least Germany had mobilized 1.9 million men. Now, they had to fight on two fronts, their eastern and their western front. France had mobilized 1.3 million. Now, how did they do that? Well, they did it by having a system where you were conscripted in your late teens, early 20s, and you served for a year. And then every 7 years, you came back for a 6-week refresher. And that went on until you were in your mid-40s. Both countries used very similar systems. And that's why they were able to mount these massive armies. And we just really couldn't compare. And I don't think people realize just what a small part in the overall battle that we were. Now, the map in the bottom left-hand corner, I'm thrown tonight because I can't just point my red pointer because the people at home wouldn't see it. So the map in the left-hand corner shows Belgium. And if you look along what I call the baseline, halfway along is Mons. And on the right-hand side, there is a map which shows the deployment. And towards the left-hand, bottom left of that map, you'll see a green line, which was us with 2 corps, more of that in a moment, defending Mons, and the French to our right defending Charleroi. And we were defending a canal and river system. But up against us were 3 German armies. And really, we and the French were just totally ill-equipped to deal with it. And I just don't think people were aware that that was a situation that we cheered our armies off to. Now, also what they almost certainly weren't aware of was the situation at the top of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. It was commanded by Sir John French. All the men on this picture had all made their names in a series of campaigns around the world, but particularly in the Boer War. Sir John French was already past his sell-by date. It took us until the end of December 1915 to finally get rid of him. His judgment was poor. He was irascible to a point at a time when senior army officers were generally pretty irascible, which was special to be noted. Now, the 2 corps that we had actually 6 divisions, and a division is somewhere around about 20,000 men, combination of infantry and, in those days, cavalry on horses, artillery, engineers, and then all the supporting logistics that you need. And 1 corps had 2 divisions, and 2 corps had 2 divisions. Now, 2 corps, so 1 corps was Douglas Haig, whatever happened to him, and 2 corps was commanded by James Grierson. James Grierson was generally accepted by his fellows to be the best tactically amongst all of them. He was also a considerable linguist, and after his death, linguistic prize was set up at Sandhurst, the Grierson Prize, which is still, or was still in existence when I was there. Unfortunately, he had a somewhat rotund figure and very, very high blood pressure. It said that bending over was a major effort. It's also said that his staff had penknives to bleed him if necessary. But for whatever, he died of an aneurysm on the train going up to the front on the 17th of August. So suddenly, one of our corps commanders has pegged it. Now, Sir John French, there were a number of commanders he could have called for. The only one that he absolutely said that he didn't want was Horace Smith-Dorrien. In a day of feuds, those two men had had a very long-standing feud. I do know what it was all about, but I'm not going to explain it tonight. But anyway, so French said, gave a list of people he'd like, and the one man he didn't want. So what did Lord Kitchener do? Smith-Dorrien took command. And it is going to cause some major problems. Now, what I want to do now is just, I'm not going to talk about the Battle of Mons as such, but seeing as this is the Angel of Mons, just a little bit of background. So on this map, on the left, it really throws me because all my army career, friendly forces have been in blue and enemy forces have been in red. And this map's the other way around, so we're in the red, so I keep having to double take on it. But we're on the left-hand side again. Smith-Dorrien's right over on the left with 2 corps, and Haig's further to the right with 1 corps. And then we have the French Fifth Army to our right. Now, despite his name, French couldn't stand Frenchmen. In fact, he couldn't stand an awful lot of people, but he had no relationship at all with his opposite number in the French army. Radio was not developed well in those days. The only link between them was liaison officers on horses. So you can imagine liaison between 2 major armies was quite slow. The French had already started to pull back at Charleroi on our right. Now, the one thing in the army you don't want, it's called, you don't want your flank turning. You don't want the enemy coming in at you from the side because the people on that side have already withdrawn. And that's exactly what was happening. And we were already under massive pressure at Mons, but we were holding. The Germans were actually losing more men than we were. But once the Fifth Army pulled back, we had no choice. And so that led to what became known as the retreat from Mons. The hardest thing to do, the hardest military exercise to do is to what I call withdraw in contact, you'd call retreat in contact. What you need to do is to break contact with the enemy so that you can get back quickly and then take up a new position. Now, Smith-Dorrien disobeyed orders. Well, he said he never had any orders, and it's quite possible, knowing French, that he didn't. But he actually managed to hold at Le Cateau on the 25th of August. And although he lost most of his guns, he was able to disengage. And from then on, the retreat from Mons was no longer in contact with the Germans. They never made contact with us. It's about it's 130 miles as a crow flies, about 150 miles by modern road from Mons back to the east of Paris, where we were going to make our stand on the River Marne, which the Battle of the Marne started on the 5th of September. So in that time, in what, 11 days, they had to march, and it was marching, something like 150 miles, and they were exhausted. A lot of that marching would have to be by night, and it was not an easy situation. So that's the background to the Angel of Mons. Now, the chronology of the story. Arthur Machen was a Welsh journalist. He was in France, and he was reporting on what was happening. But he also wrote fiction. And he wrote for the Evening News. And the Evening News put fact and fictional stories together. I wouldn't say right on the front page, but certainly within the bulk of the newspaper, that was the case. Now, Machen had had the idea at the retreat, at the Battle of Mons, and as the retreat went on, that they went right past the battlefield of Agincourt from 1415. So he had thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to write a story where the bowmen from 1415 came to help the soldiers in 1914? So he wrote this completely fictional story called The Bowmen. In the story, and he wrote the story in the first person, by the way. He didn't say, I prayed to St. George, but he said, I was there when a soldier prayed to St. George, and lo and behold, in the sky, the bowmen from Agincourt appeared in the sky and held off the Germans. Shortly afterwards, so that's 29 September, so by then, the Battle of Mons, the Battle of Aisne, were moving into Ypres and so on and so forth. So the immediate battle is long over when this article is written. But he starts getting asked, what are your sources? And he said, I have no sources, it's fiction. And people were saying, but we've heard from soldiers that they saw it. And what got it even more difficult was a number of clergymen contacted him to ask if they could reprint the story in their parish magazines. And he said, yes, but please say that it's fiction. They didn't. He got to the point where in the middle of 1915, he produced a book called The Bowmen and Other Legends with a very long preface. And in that preface, he made it very clear that his story and these other legends were stories and were not true. That created even more problem because, as I say, now, I've never actually had to do these things in war, but I have done long night marches when I was already exhausted, when I was a young officer, and particularly when I was an officer cadet at Sandhurst. And you're asleep half the time. Guy in front stops, you probably hit him and you walk into him and wake up. You see all kinds of strange things. I once thought I was being charged by the enemy. Turned out to be some very stable, static bushes. So it's not surprising that these very, very tired soldiers had seen things. You do. And so there's a real problem. So anyway, in that preface, Arthur Machen wrote, this is, you can see from all the dots, I've thinned this out considerably. He said that his light fiction had been accepted as a solidus of fact. He'd failed in the art of letters, but he'd succeeded in deception, which had never been his intention. Now, he's writing in the middle of 1915. He says, sometime in April, the snowball of rumor that then set rolling has been rolling ever since, growing bigger and bigger, now swollen to a monstrous size. And that story is still, I mean, you know, it came to Chris's mind as soon as he was thinking, what can we do to talk about angels? And I've known the story for a long time. What I didn't know until I started researching it was the sheer length of time this all went on for. I thought this was all a phenomenon in the back end of August 1914. But actually he didn't write the story till the end of September. And the whole thing is rolling on right through. There were books written, other books written, saying that he was wrong. And there were books being published in 1915, 1916 on this subject. It just took on a life of its own. So that's the story of the Angel of Mons. It's not true. Now, when I was regimental secretary, I used to spend Remembrance Sunday morning at the cathedral and with the mayor. And I can remember a sermon by Tom Wright, later Bishop Tom, and then the Dean of Lichfield, in which he said the Church of England had a lot to answer for in the First World War. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But it is true that a lot of clergymen wanted to believe that there had been divine intervention to save our forces. And I think the Church of England was a major source of this fictional story sort of taking on a fact of its own. I don't totally agree with what Tom Wright said that day. It was a long sermon, but I think in this case there is some validity. Now, I'm going to finish on this now, but just to give you an idea, go on the internet, put in Angel of Mons pictures, hundreds. I've just picked 4. Top right was published in the end of 1915. And it's difficult, it's certainly difficult to see on my computer, and if you can see better there, but up in the white cloud is a series of bowmen. They're not dressed in 15th century garb, they're dressed in what was then modern soldiers' garb, but at least they're bowmen. Look bottom left, you've got a figure. Could it be St. Michael? Could it be St. George with wings? Who knows? You've got a similar sort of ghostly set of figures top left, and again bottom right. And so as more and more artists took up this idea, so the whole thing spread that you have a single angel, you don't have bowmen at all. So it really did, and it still does. I mean, someone said to me the other day, I've seen the film. Well, I haven't, I don't watch films a lot, but it really has taken on a life of its own. Anyway, so that's that. I'm going to move on now to three men who certainly were driven by their spiritual life in the First World War. The first one is Woodbine Willie. Woodbine Willie was Geoffrey Stoddart Kennedy. He got a military cross for bringing wounded soldiers in at the Battle of Messines in 1917, just before the Third Battle of Ypres, which many of you will know as Passchendaele. He was over 30 when the First World War started. He volunteered immediately. He was the seventh of 9 children of a clergyman in Leeds. His mother was of Irish background. It's become a bit of a thing. Last night, Chris was saying where the various rectors had been educated. Now, he went to Leeds Grammar, a very, very respected institution, but not at the time. In the First World War, those northern grammar schools, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, fantastic place of education, were seen as lesser to the proper public schools. Such was the attitude then. So, I mean, he had a fantastic education, but not at an upper crust place. And he studied at Trinity College, Dublin. In the 20s, when he was being a real thorn in the side of both the Church of England and the government, he claimed his Irish heritage because by then the Irish Free State had broken away and so on, and he was really being quite a rebel. During the war, he was actually at one stage posted with a bayonet fighting team going around just demonstrating bayonet fighting, and he was giving these stirring sermons to the troops. Now, again, think back over 100 years. It was a society where authority was very much respected, and because rectors, padres, chaplains were respected men, and soldiers had been to church very often, and certainly, for instance, up in the Potteries, probably a local Methodist church or other nonconformist church, but they were used to being spoken to by chaplains and so on. And he was inspiring, and he believed totally in the war. I know I have a habit of going on, so I'm just popping my watch out. So he became an absolute legend in the war, not only for his sermons, but also for this habit of taking packs of woodbines and handing them out to soldiers, hence his nickname. Now, he went from being totally supportive of the war to, after the war, being converted to Christian socialism and pacifism. Now, he wasn't alone in that. George MacLeod, who was later in the 1930s to form the Iona community, followed very much the same route, although he had been a serving officer rather than a chaplain in the First World War. Stoddart Kennedy had produced quite a lot of poems which the soldiers liked. They were published in 1919 as Rough Rhymes and More Rough Rhymes, and later all his poetry was published together. So he was a known poet. But after the war, he wrote a whole series of books, the first of which was called Lies. And they were lies as he saw them about the First World War. And then a whole series afterwards. He had he'd been at St. Paul's, Worcester, when his first parish as an incumbent, when he joined up in 1914. He got a London parish immediately after the war. but spent more time out of it than in it. So in the end, in 1925, he moved to the Industrial Christian Fellowship, which was really ideal for a man who was by this stage promoting workers' rights, seeing very much the Christian socialism side of his faith. About that time, he published about his fifth book, was The Word and Work. And again, it was, he at one stage said, if churches are not inspiring the men in the factories, then we should get rid of the churches. So he really was a thorn in the side of the Church of England at the time. Now, he'd ruined his health, and not only in the First World War, but with his fantastic schedule of talks in the 1920s, and he died at age 45 in 1929. Now, it's said that the Dean of Westminster refused to bury him in Poets' Corner because he was a socialist. I have grave doubts about that. He wasn't a major poet. And frankly, I don't think he wanted to be buried in Westminster Abbey anyway. What actually happened was his funeral services at Worcester Cathedral. And if you go to Worcester, go to the sort of military area where most of the Worcestershire Regiment flags are, and you'll see a plaque to Woodbine Willie. So his funeral service was held there. And then there was the funeral cortege then went to his old parish church, St. Paul's, Worcester, where he's buried. And when I first read this, it reminded me very much of Princess Diana. In that case, they were showing flowers onto the hearse. In his case, they were throwing packets of woodbines. But you can see from that picture, bottom left, that the roads are thronged. There was enormous sadness at his death and enormous respect for him. And he has become one of the sort of iconic figures of the First World War, if you like. Now, my second figure is also someone that you will probably recognize the name. It's Tubby Clayton. He also won a military cross, but actually more for his activities in welfare than Stoddart Kennedy has done actually on the battlefield. Tubby, I've shown his education again, partly because Chris was doing it last night, and partly because St. Paul's in London and Oxford shows him to be a much more establishment figure. He wasn't, he was wonderful to soldiers. He had a wonderful relationship with soldiers, but I think it was a different one than the one that Stoddart Kennedy has had. In 1915, the senior chaplain in the area of Ypres wanted to open a home for soldiers in Popperinge, which is just to the west of Ypres, and it's where the soldiers who went on duty in Ypres were going. It developed a very unsavory nightlife there, and they were looking to find a refuge for the soldiers. They found a house. It had been built in the 17th century by a German hop merchant, and had later on been extended, and at this stage was owned by a rich merchant in Belgium. The house had been damaged by long-distance gunfire from Ypres, so he'd moved out. The British Army had taken it on initially as a headquarters building, and then these two chaplains, Neville Talbot and Tubby Clayton, managed to convince the army to give it them as a refuge, as a home for soldiers, a place to go to escape the other kind of places that were available in Popperinge. And the home was opened in December 1915. It was called Talbot House, not after Neville, but after his younger brother George, who died in the Battle of Ypres earlier that year, part of the golden generation, which had sort of disappeared in the early part of the First World War. Nigel Talbot actually objected to the name, but was told to shut up, and that was it. It became known as TH, and then because in signalling at the time, T was TOC, so it became known as TOC H, and TOC H is now a massive international organization still going. Tubby ran it in his own way. He was a great one for little signs, and if you go and visit, you'll see them all over the house. And if you actually go on TOC H website, they've got fantastic, you can sit at home and watch it all. There's 360-degree presentations and so on. But they've got a number of his little posters around. On his door, it said, "Abandon rank, all ye who enter here." By the front door, it had a way out sign saying, "To pessimists, way out." So he was very much for suitable little messages. And it really did become a place where soldiers could relax, and it was a Christian place, but it was really there for them to go to and come away from the horrors of Ypres that they were seeing. At top left, you'll see the attic. Now that attic had originally been for drying hops some 100 years before. He turned it into a chapel, which he called the upper room. I had cause to be talking to Simon Baker, for anyone not from St Michael's online, then our former rector last week, and I was talking about this talk. And Simon was, I visited the upper room, and there's a wonderful feeling there. But Simon was saying one of his parishioners was an expert on the First World War and took a parish trip there. And part of it, they worshipped in the upper room at Toc H. And Simon said it really was a tingly feeling. You really felt that you were back with those soldiers 100 years before, worshipping there. You didn't have to worship in the upper room, but many of them did. After the army closed it in 1918 because the battle moved on. And then after the war, the merchant came back. But so many soldiers were calling on him to see the place that they remembered, that in the end, he sold the house, and a benefactor bought it and presented it back to Toc H. So it reopened again in 1929. Tubby had actually taken all the elements from the upper room and taken them back to his parish in London, and they'd been on display there. It closed again during the Second World War. The people of Poperinghe took everything out of the house that was in any way relevant to the Toc H story and hid them in their cellars. The Germans came and found this sort of eerily empty house, but they used it as an officer's mess throughout the war. At the end of the war, every piece was returned, and Toc H started up again in 1944. And it's now a museum, and it's a bed and breakfast. You need to book well ahead, but you can actually have bed and breakfast there, as some soldiers were able to. There were only a small number of accommodation rooms, but it was possible for soldiers to stay there, and it's possible to stay there now if you go. If you are in that part of Belgium, and you think you'd like to go and see Toc H, allow plenty of time. Their one-way system and their parking are vicious. And I can remember Caroline and I were planning a quick 1 hour trip, and I think it took us a whole morning because we had to park on the outskirts and walk quite a way in. So, but it is well worth it. And Tubby Clayton, as well as his MC, he had a companion of honor. So he was very much in the top echelons and very much an established figure. He died in 1972. So that's the second of my guys. The third is someone who Chris was talking about last night and trailing, and that's the Prebendary Percival Howard. He wasn't a Prebendary when he signed up as an army chaplain in 1915. He was then quite a young clergyman. He'd only been at in this parish, his first parish after a series of curacies, since 1913. Now, the picture of him up on the left there is the picture that was on show with all the rectors. It's very much later in life. And he does look quite an establishment figure. My own feeling about him, and I'm very grateful to Chris Baker for a lot of his biographical research on this, is of a very humble man. He's very much Radley and Cambridge. I think he was St. Catherine's, and in the notes Chris sent me, he said they shared a college, so it's not something I am able to say. He was an incredibly humble man. All his writings that I've seen in the parish magazine of the time, all his letters home, show extreme humility. Despite quite a upper class upbringing, he really connected with his parishioners here and with the soldiers in the trenches. Just to give that idea, you can see bottom left. Chris, where is that plaque, by the way? I forgot to ask you. So the plaque is behind me up in the chancel, and the bell ringers is up in the ringing chamber. And In the middle is his grave. It's quite small, so it's a cremated remains area, obviously. He was a bachelor. The 1939 census shows him with one housekeeper, so the pair of them must have rattled around in that massive old rectory they had in the old days. But it is tiny. That I had to clean that up for the grave is just to the left. It's just behind the choir vestry, just beyond the east window, and then to the south a little bit. I've cleaned it up to take that picture, but it's tiny. On one side, it simply gives his name and his dates of his life. And on the other, it says rector of St. Michael's and gives the dates that he did it. And that shows a level of humility, I think, in the man. And yet, those two other plaques clearly indicate that he was much loved by his parishioners. And so I think very much a figure in line with the others. Now, he enlisted in 1915 as a chaplain. He was very concerned, it shows in the letters which were published in the parish magazine, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that he was very concerned about leaving his parish, where he'd not long come, but he felt that he had a duty. He then, he signed up, at least he ended up with, and I'm sure he asked to be, with the 46th North Midland Division, which was a territorial division, and he finished up with 137 Staffordshire Brigade. And that was made up of first-line territorial soldiers, the best of the territorial soldiers, 2 from the North Staffords, 2 from the South. The North Stafford battalions, where one was based around Tamworth, Lichfield and Burton, and the other one was based in the Potteries in northern Staffordshire and the Moorlands. The 2 South Stafford ones were essentially what is now the West Midlands, and they were based around Wolverhampton and Walsall. And they also took in parts of Sandwell and Dudley. So the old South Staffords area, think the Black Country boroughs now. But he got himself the job as chaplain with those men. His letters, he was actually home on leave in October 1915, and he wrote a letter shortly after he got back to the front, having been on leave, and talked about a week of gloom and sadness, of wounded, suffering and dead. And that was the end of the Battle of Lewes in September and October 1915. The battle was virtually over. They wanted to put a fresh division in to go along with alongside a French attack. The 46th North Midland had been in France for about 6 months by then. Their divisional commander was a very experienced soldier, and he queried the plan of attack. And he was told by his corps commander, a gentleman called Haig, don't worry, we've got so many guns, all the guns that have been supporting everything at Lewes, you've got them all. You will walk in. You may have heard that phrase before. It was later described by the official history of the war as a total waste of soldiers' lives. They didn't walk in, and the soldiers from the 137 Brigade were Staffords. There were also a brigade of Lincolns and Leicesters, and another one of Sherwood Foresters, Nottingham and Derby, and all of them took massive casualties. And he would have been home then, and probably dealing with the families who are getting those dreaded telegrams saying that your loved one has died or has been badly wounded. And then he went back to the front. In November 1915, it was the weather, cold rain, mud beyond description, rubber boots up to our knees, trying to keep smiling. And then it's perfectly wonderful how cheerful the men keep. Nothing seems to damp their enthusiasm. So again, he really was getting sort of online with the men. Now, he was to have quite a change. And I wrote an article to complement these letters he'd written, because I knew what he was talking about. But the censor and the fact that he was writing contemporary and people would have known wouldn't have made a lot of sense to people. Anyway, he talked in December 1915 of going to an unknown destination. Everyone thought maybe Gallipoli. But actually, he then talked about in training, and they actually went on Christmas Day to Marseille, where they got on a steamer And this isn't the whole of 46th North Midland Division, it's mostly the 137th Staffordshire Brigade with their chaplain. And they went to Egypt. They disembarked in Egypt on the 5th of January. And his next letter in January 16 talked about brilliant sunshine and sea bathing. Now, the Stafford regimental history says that the idea was that the Turks had just beaten us in Gallipoli. Would they then march straight down and take the Suez Canal? The Staffords wrote that they found just some bits of barbed wire and a few machine guns. So they set out to establish a proper defensive position. And once they'd done that, we have diaries as well. And one of the diaries from a young officer talks about having excellent nights in Cairo. I imagine they didn't take their 41-year-old bachelor chaplain with them in those days, but we can't be sure. Anyway, they quickly realized they had so many troops who'd come out of Gallipoli in Egypt that they didn't need these boys, and they were only there for less than a month, and then they were shipped back on to Marseille and back by train, and by February, they're back on the Western Front again. The next letter, then it was, his letters were about trench life through the spring and early summer. But then he talks about deciding to return to St. Michael's after his 12 months. Says it's no easy task. He talks about, is it his duty to stay with the troops? But he says there's no scarcity of chaplains, and there are plenty of people who aren't incumbents, i.e. curates and so on, younger men who are available and want to come. So he's made the decision, I ought not to leave the parish for more than a year. His letters also reflect his thanks to his curate and to his church wardens and to his congregation for keeping St. Michael's going in his absence. He clearly felt very, very strongly about them. So I think very much a man up with Woodbine Willie, maybe not so well known, and Tubby Clayton. And I think the longest serving rector, to my knowledge, that we've had, and seems to me an outstanding man. I wish I'd known him. Right, now, I promised in the blurb I put for Churches Together that I'd talk about my hero, Bill Coltman. This is a man who was a member of what were then called the Plymouth Brethren, now called the Brethren, and his family in Burton are still very active members of the Brethren. And Bill was born in Rangemore, just to the west of Burton, in 1891. Mum was widowed. She made money by a milk round, in her case, taking churns of milk round by a horse and cart, and her children helped her with that. Bill followed his father into being a jobbing gardener on the Staffordshire-Derbyshire border. He joined up at the end of 1914. He was trained. He was out in France by June 1915, but he didn't actually get to join what was then called the First Six North Staffords until after the Battle of Lewes, because the reinforcements were then needed and these new troops came in. So Bill would have gone to Egypt, and he may well have met Percival Howard at that time, who was his chaplain. Bill was, although Bill was very much in the nonconformist world, then a chaplain was chaplain to everyone. That's happened all my army life as well, and it's one of the reasons that I hold such strong ecumenical feelings. There is some conflict between the family and the regiment, although we're good friends, but there's just one disagreement. They believe that Bill never carried arms. It is our belief that he was a soldier and that he was involved in the battle that Percival just missed, because, Percival Howard just missed, because he just left at the end of June. And on the 1st of July, the first day of the Somme, the 46th North Midland Division was part of an abortive attack right up to the north. It was a deception attack on the first day of the Somme. And I've shown in the bottom left there the ground they had to go across. And it was a swamp. And it would have been even worse then than it is now. And they got nowhere. There were 3 lines of wire, and they never got beyond the first wire. And Bill got a mention in dispatches, and that shows on the medal to the right with the oak leaf, for bringing 3 men in on his shoulders. Now, we regimentally know that he's next named on the 3rd of July as an official stretcher bearer. And I've shown that stretcher bearer is one of his brassards, which he presented to the Regimental Museum. So we do know that he was definitely a stretcher bearer from then. Now, from that time on, he went on to win, first of all, an MM, a military medal, and then another military medal. That's the bar. And that's the medal you can see top center. And then a Distinguished Conduct Medal. The first MM was for bringing an officer in from 90 yards away from the enemy. Now, people said it was a miracle. I believe the miracle, the Germans were so taken by his bravery that they must have aimed to miss. They would have hit him. But Bill believed his life was in God's hands. He firmly believed that. And therefore, he said, I was never brave. I just said, God, you know, God will do with me as he wishes. And he never classified what he did as brave because of that. The second MM was for a whole series of incidents involved with trench warfare. The first Distinguished Conduct Medal was for something he did all the time. After any attack, he would go out into no man's land and scour it. Now, he had one great advantage. He never got lost. There's all kinds of stories of attacks not happening because officers got lost in the massive trench systems. Bill was actually used as a guide. He actually guided the king around their part of the trenches. And they used to say, if you get lost, you hope Bill comes to find you because he never gets lost. And that was sort of a great advantage for him. I'm speeding up a bit now. He got his second Distinguished Conduct Medal, and I think this was meant to be a VC, but got downgraded, on the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, when the 46th North Midland Division, and particularly spearheaded by the Staffordshire TA, crossed the St. Quentin Canal on the 29th of September 1918. There's a posed picture there. When they actually crossed the canal, it was in deep mist. But the picture on the left, if any of you know the concert hall behind the town hall at the Civic Hall at Walsall, there are two enormous murals, and the one on the left is the crossing of the St. Quentin Canal, and that's the one I've shown there. Bill again was scooping up, you know, going out into no man's land, and bringing in the wounded, and also bringing in the dead as well, because it was quite important if there was a body to bury, and he felt that very strongly. However, he got his VC 5 days later, on the 3rd of October. He got it at what that green swathe with the trees on top, up top right. It's near the village of Sequahart, and the hill was called by the Army Mannequin Hill. And they clearly had determined to get Bill a VC before the war was over. That citation for the VC documents by name the three men he brought in. It documents in detail what he did. And I believe his commanding officer, his brigadier, his divisional commander had all said, we are going to get Bill a VC, which he absolutely did. He was a legend by then amongst all the Staffordshire Territorial, North or South Staffords. And on bottom left, I show his Victoria Cross and his Distinguished Conduct Medal with a bar on it showing that he got two of them. The medals there, he left, they're worth, when he left them to us in the 70s, they were conservatively worth 100,000 quid. They're probably, I don't know, anything $500,000 to $1 million now. He's an iconic figure. He's the most decorated other rank from the First World War. There are officers with 2 VCs, but nobody else with the range of medals he's got. He was actually entitled to 3 more, 2 coronation medals and a Cadet Force medal, which he never got around to putting in. And there he is in old age when I met him, and just an inspirational man, just his whole life dedicated to God. And the other thing was, and all these men have the same thing in common, was duty. Bill reckoned he was doing his duty. I'm sure if you talk to those other people I've named, they were all doing their duty. And it was a time when you thought about your duty rather than about your rights. And I think all these men, as well as their Christian persuasion, were also driven by a strong feeling of duty. Now, I say we've had a lot of cherubim, so I thought we'd get to a few seraphim. Now, this only came to me last night, so I haven't done quite the depth of research. I actually put in heroines of the First World War into Google, and I got 10 names. Now, 5 of them were Americans. And I thought they only entered the war in 1917. Let's not get too excited about this. So I've knocked 3 of the Americans out. But O.C. Inglis is known. She was a doctor, and she tried to sign up as a medical doctor and was rejected. And so she formed the Scottish Women's Hospital Unit, and then had it accepted when she completely formed it, funded it, and then they went to France. So that's Dr. Elsie Inglis. She had been a suffragette. Flora Sands, I'm a great fan of Antiques Road Trip, and they stop during the road trip and they go and look at things of interest in the area where they are. And last night had a memorial to Flora Sands, which they visited. She was quite a well-born young lady. She tried to enlist as a nurse, but she was a real tomboy. They had a big estate and she just roamed around it. I think most of her education was sort of, came from that. And when she tried to enlist as a nurse, they said, but you've no nursing experience. Now, there was a big area in the south of Serbia that the British and the French were at, so it wasn't that difficult to get to Serbia. So she went to Serbia and enlisted as a nurse there. She ended up as a soldier. The Serbs ended up having to pull back after a massive German and Austro-Hungarian attack, and in winter. And she did that as a Serbian soldier. She got promoted to corporal. She later got promoted to Sergeant Major, and then in 1922, the Serbian army had promoted her to captain. When the Second World War came, she went back to Serbia and picked up her commission again, although she wasn't on the front line then. She acted as an officer for the Serbs in the Second World War as well. Quite a lady. Evelina Haverfield was another suffragette. She founded the, I need to look at my crib here, the Women's Emergency Corps. And again, she founded a nursing service and took it out to Serbia. People kept rejecting these offers. You had to join up and do things properly or they wouldn't take you. So women, these inspirational women, they just founded things and then said, look, here it is. And Evelyn Haverfield was another one who did that. Edith Wharton, you might recognize that name. She was a well-known author, but she'd been living in France since the turn of the century, since 1899. And she immediately used her fame to fundraise, particularly for the French hospitals. And she ended the war with a Légion d'honneur from the French and an Order of Leopold from the Belgians. Helen Fairchild was a US nurse. Elsie Inglis, Evelina Haverfield, and Helen Fairchild all died in the war or just after the war from illnesses that they got as a result of their efforts. And she is known because her letters in America were published. Helen Gwynne Vaughan was a more establishment figure, and she started the women's, what I know as the Women's Army Corps, and I think you all know about Edith Cavell. Chris is hovering because I've gone over. So I'm just going to finish on my very last slide of another one of these sort of great legends. The top right is what the figure, which is Virgin and Child, on the top of the Basilica at Albert, which is just behind the Somme battlefields, looks like now. You can see in the other 3 pictures what it looked like in 1916. Both the British and the German army had a legend that if it fell, the side that was responsible for falling would lose the war. It stayed like that. In 1918, the Germans mounted a late attack known as the German Spring Offensive of 1918. And they came right back across that Somme battlefield and took Albert. And they were using that as a spotting place for artillery spotters. So we didn't worry about who might win or lose the war. We knocked out, we zonked it with artillery, and we knocked the whole tower down, Virgin and all. But we did win the war, so that was another legend that didn't quite work. So as usual, my time control is terrible, so I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. I was hovering purely because I knew Ted was about to finish, and because I wanted to actually stop sharing screen so you could see him in his full glory, so he could answer questions to you. So if you could come back into view, Ted. Could I ask people in the congregation to simply raise your hand? I'm going to go to the back of church now and see if there are any questions coming through on chat as well. But first, if there are anyone out there, please ask your questions.
Two on chat, I can see. Any takers? I usually have this effect on my audiences. I think it's because I go on so long. We've got a couple on chat, so you know, it's horrible looking at yourself on this. You see just how bald I am. Doesn't look like that when I'm shaving. So anyone got any thoughts? Just a matter of interest, how many of the women's names did you recognize? Edith Cavell, did you recognize any of the others? Yeah, and Edith Wharton. But those other women, heroines, and yet you probably did know Woodbine Willie, and you probably did know Tubby Clayton. And it's why, albeit a bit late, I suddenly thought an awful lot of women we should be celebrating from the First World War. So I'll try and do a better job on Seraphim next time I get to do this talk. Chris, so have you got anything?
No, there's the chats that you see on your screen were fairly general chats,
Okay.
telling me to point the camera in the right direction during the course of the talk.
Right.
So there are no questions on chat. I'll give people another opportunity to...
With luck, if people rush, they can get home just in time for, what is it Trevor went to watch?
Yeah, Trevor has already left to go to watch a television programme. I do apologise, Alison. I can see you looking horrified there.
He should be home any minute, Alison.
If there are no questions, I'd like to just say a very big thank you for Ted. Presentations like that don't come easy by any means. There's a huge amount of work involved. So Ted, thank you very much indeed. And can we again, those of us who are here, show our appreciation in a noble way.
Thank you very much.
Tomorrow evening's presentation is by Stephen Barton, who will be talking about angels in scripture. Some of you will know Stephen had a minor operation on Monday, and he thinks it's sensible that he should actually join us to give the talk on the big screen from his home. So we will still gather here. Those of you who come here will still get wine and nibbles. So that's the bribe to come to church, but we'll also be online. But thank you all again for joining. I hope you have a good evening. The recording again will go online sometime, maybe tonight, probably not, probably more likely tomorrow morning. Thank you again. Goodbye to you all.